Hi guys, my name is Shane Cuthbert. Welcome back yet again to another lesson. Let's get straight into it. I'm going to share with you another example, okay? So maybe the heights thing wasn't for you. If conquering your fears isn't really for you, if going to the gym and getting healthy isn't for you, if you're not starting a business or anything like that, if you're doing something else, then by all means, just remember that it is the same formula can be used in no matter what we want to achieve. So many people are watching these videos for many different reasons, for overcoming addictions, for, building their businesses, for just getting past those general hurdles that life is throwing at us. So, just moving forward, I just want you to remember that even if this example doesn't particularly apply to you, the formula does. It's the same formula that we use over and over again in different situations. So much like the example of overcoming a fear, crossing the bridge, we're now going to talk about an example of getting healthy, getting motivated to go to the gym. How do you start that process? Let's say you set your alarm clock the night before, and your alarm clock now, it's 5 a.m. and your alarm clock starts going off. So you wake up because the alarm's going off, and what's the first thing you're thinking? The first thing you're thinking is overwhelm. You're picturing in your mind, being at the gym, forcing out your last rep, you're doing your last squats, you're doing all of this stuff that, is really not what you feel like doing right now while you're laying in bed. Now, of course, your mind's going to show you a scene like that, okay, where you're exerting yourself, because that's the part of this task that you want to achieve that's going to require the most energy to do and achieve. And when you look at the scale, right now you're sitting in bed, you're picturing yourself, in an hour from now at the gym, really sweating, really pumping weights, you're on the treadmill. When you look at that scale, that looks really, really far away. Now your mind's thinking, this is how much energy I've got here. This is how much energy that's going to take. Right now I just don't have the energy, so that's okay. I'll wake up later, I'll set the alarm clock, I'll hit snooze. It's something I'll put off till later, okay? So I'll procrastinate a little bit. Eventually you start saying to yourself things like, I'll go to the gym later tonight or later, this afternoon, or I'll go tomorrow morning, I'll give it a miss for today. And that's when you really start procrastinating, and then obviously if you, with repetition, you practice procrastination, then you don't get things done. You never get it done. If you keep putting something off, you're never going to achieve that goal. So don't practice procrastination. So for a child, that's like asking them to stand on the edge of the river and asking them, to swim across to the other side. It's got a strong, really strong current. It's filled with sharks. Of course that's going to be overwhelming, okay? The child's going to freak out. The child's not going to do that. That's terrifying. So the trick is being able to reach out and place some stepping stones so that it's not as overwhelming for that child to get to the other side, okay? It's just one more step. It's an extra step. There's a stepping stone to, step onto. So the question is, how do you do that? What you have to do is you have to interrupt your thoughts, okay? So your alarm goes off, you wake up, you've got these thoughts coming into your mind about exerting yourself at the gym. You've just got to interrupt them, okay? You've got to say, whoa. Hold on a second. Let's not think about that right now, because that is just a result of my feeling. Let's acknowledge the feeling. And the feeling may be, yes, you don't feel quite energetic at that moment, but you know that feeling will pass. So you've just got to put those thoughts off, much like we did on the bridge. You've just got to say, whoa, hang on a second, get out of here, that negative thought. You've just got to be consciously aware of that happening. So you've got to tell yourself in that moment, don't worry about thinking that far ahead, okay? So don't worry about thinking about being at the gym. Zoom right in, break it down. What's the next step? What's the next step? The next step is getting out of bed. Then what's the next step? You're out of bed. It's time to have a shower. So you're saying to your inner child, look, just get up, just have a shower, okay? Just take that step. If after having a shower you feel particularly uncomfortable, you want to go back to bed, That's fine, but at least you made some progress. You got out of bed, you had a shower, you've already taken 2 steps towards that goal, okay, towards achieving that thing. And you'll probably find in most cases, once you get up and have a shower, once you initially just get over that hurdle of getting out of bed, taking that first step, the others aren't so hard afterwards. Once you get up, once you have a shower, it's not so hard. You don't feel so overwhelmed anymore. Most people don't go back to bed. They end up, being able to go to the gym. It's quite simple after that. You get dressed. Okay, that's another step. Reward yourself for that. You get in the car. You drive to the gym. That's another step. And before you know, you're at the gym. But let's just say that doesn't work for you. Okay, so let's say you take a shower and you've got that inner resistance that's telling you, no, you don't want to go to the gym. It's cold outside. It's cold inside. Your inner child saying, don't make me do this. So how do you break that down even further? How do you make those steps smaller? Okay, so here's a smaller step. Okay, so before getting out of bed, what if we try just sitting up? So you just sit up for a moment. Your inner child says, that's almost impossible to resist, like sitting up, like, yeah, that's not that overwhelming, that's okay, I guess we can do that. So you sit up. Now that you've sat up, are you just like, okay, next step, let's go to the gym? Like, we can go now, I've sat up? No, of course not. Okay, but what you've got to do is you've just got to praise the effort, that effort that you took to sit up, like, reward yourself for that and tell yourself, what, well done, like you got up. You've made a start, okay? You're not at ground zero anymore. So reward yourself for that. And it's a good feeling. Now that you've sat up in bed, that's one extra step from lying down. So, you're already on the way now. Now ask yourself, what's the next step? How about the next step is that you peel back the blankets and you stand up. That's it. You're still communicating with that inner child and you're saying, look, if you still want to go to bed after that, that's fine. But how about we just try the next step on for size, okay? Let's see how that feels. And because the step's such a small step, you know that your inner child isn't going to feel particularly overwhelmed about that thing. So let's say you peel back the blankets, you get out of bed, and your inner child's saying, oh, okay, you feel that resistance and it just wants to go back to bed, okay? It's too cold, just wants you to go back to bed. So you stop. This is where you're at that comfort zone, okay? You're outside of your comfort zone, you've just got out of bed, your inner child's not feeling it, but you stop yourself and you just say, okay, let's just take one more step. We're already standing up, so how about we just stay standing up for an extra 10 seconds, okay? So you look at your watch, you go, look, we'll just stop for a minute, we'll just hold it here and see how this feels, okay? So you count down from 10, 9, 8, eventually you get down to 0, and you go back to bed. But now while you're laying in bed, it feels a little bit different because you've just pushed yourself and you've pushed yourself past that point of the comfort zone. Now you sort of feel like it's a little bit of a waste going back to bed. You think, oh, I was just out of bed. Now you start getting those thoughts, oh, I should get up. I should go do this. So you ask yourself, what's the next step? How about this time we do the same thing? We peel back the blankets. We sit up in bed, we get out of bed, we go and we have a shower. So you have a shower, you pack your gym bag, you go and you get in the car, you drive to the gym, you go upstairs, you start warming up, you start your first set. At this stage, you've reached the point where you have momentum. It's taken you a whole bunch of steps to get to this point. This whole example is really about, making a start. It's all about creating that momentum, and it's really, just what I talked about before is breaking down those steps to be so small. Taking a shower. If that's too much of an effort to you, break it down to just taking your clothes off, turning the shower. There is steps that we can break down in every situation. So just break them down to their most basic, step, in order to just start doing them. And then they accumulate. And then, you're able to do the things that you want to do. So look, when you've got artists, when you've got writers, musicians, what they'll tell you that happens, a lot is there's this thing called writer's block, okay? And it's really, really common. They'll tell you that, look, sometimes they just get this writer's block and they're unable to come up with anything. They're unable to write anything or do anything or create anything. And what more experienced, writers and musicians, will tell you is they'll say, look, the way to overcome that is to just start writing anything. Okay, if you want to create a song, okay, and you think, oh, I don't know how to do it, you just start playing anything. Just pick up the guitar and start playing a few chords. And eventually, just that momentum sets in and you might get an idea or you might get something pop into your mind and you're able to then pursue it, and it turns into a book. But when you sit down, you've got a blank piece of paper, you don't know where you're going. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is start. Okay, once we make that start, momentum starts coming and you've got a few chapters written down already, you already sort of then have a sense of who the character is and where they're going and what they're doing, so you're able to, finish that story and really create a book. Think of this an example. It's almost like getting a rocket off the ground. Most of the time, the effort, the energy, the fuel, it's all used just getting that rocket off the ground, okay? Just making a start. Once that rocket, makes its way out, into the atmosphere, it starts sort of flying around space with little to no effort or at all, okay? It's dropped all its fuel tanks and it's just sort of floating around. There's not much resistance anymore. All these examples are essentially examples of creating a bond and creating that trust between our inner parent and our inner child, okay? It's about saying that it's okay, and it's about, creating that self-communication and that relationship, building that relationship and building self-trust, okay? Over time, when these things become habits, your inner child then trusts you to go forward more. So over time, with repetition, once you learn how to, acknowledge your inner child's feelings and just, start to acknowledge and learn the steps, next time you hit an obstacle or hit a challenge that's outside of your comfort zone, your inner child, because it's got that relationship that it's developed with you, now has enough trust and faith in you to know that, you're not going to put it in danger and you're going to do the right thing and that it's going to be okay. Once you develop that self-trust through self-communication, there's really no stopping you moving forward. When you picture, maybe yourself, that's sitting down with your 7-year-old self, your 7-year-old self is going to, say things like, don't make me do this. I'm scared. Why aren't you on my side? That's perfectly common. And if that's the response that you pick up from your inner child, that's just happening because you've spent so long numbing and rejecting and turning away from those feelings and those inner voice. Now you have developed the ability to listen. And that's why you're hearing those things now. Previously you didn't care. Previously you didn't have that self-communication. You didn't have that self-trust. It's now something that you're actively building. By being able to negotiate with your inner child and let it know that it's okay, just taking a few extra steps, telling your inner child that, those few steps count as progress and that there's no rules, there's no more musts or expectations. You're not telling your inner child anymore that if you don't do this, you're a failure or blaming them. Once you just accept them for who they are and how they're feeling, it's going to want to work with you and communicate with you a little bit better. Your communication's just improved. What you're doing when you're creating that unconditional environment, okay, that environment where there's no conditions on anything and you're able to accept, those things that your inner child's saying to you and acknowledge them, and you're not putting pressure on, that's exactly what you're doing, is you're decreasing that parental voice of must so that you get into a space where, you can achieve that task, you can achieve that goal. When you decrease the must, you're decreasing the pressure. When there's no pressure, it's a lot easier for you to achieve what it is you're setting out to achieve. And when you're in the process of praising yourself for your efforts, that's when you're also sliding, that scale of confidence, okay? The more you praise your efforts, the more your confidence, really starts to improve. What happens when you go to the gym, you do a workout, but afterwards you're feeling like, oh, okay, I could have maybe done a little bit more. I didn't really achieve what I wanted to achieve. What you're communicating to yourself there is that, going to the gym that day was a failure. Okay, you didn't sweat as much, you didn't work as hard, you just didn't do whatever your expectation was. You have these musts, okay? You've said you must do this, you must burn so many calories on the machine, the particular machine you're using. You must do this many repetitions, it must feel this way. And you start feeling like you've just let yourself down, like you haven't achieved those goals. But really what you're communicating to yourself is, again, that failure. Okay, you're communicating these negative things to yourself. What you really want to do is, in that moment, zoom out and see it for what it is and acknowledge that you took all these steps just to get to the gym in the first place. You still got to the gym, so you still made progress. You still made more progress than if you had have stayed home in bed. You've got to acknowledge that. Now, as a habit, if you keep zooming out, again and again with repetition, what you're going to see is you're going to start to see just, for yourself, the way that you were conditioning yourself. You're going to start to see that conditioning effect. You're going to see that the relationship you've developed with yourself is much more important in the long run than the outcome in the short term. Okay? You're going to have that growth mindset that we are seeking. So maybe you didn't clean the whole house that day. What did you tell yourself about the experience? Have you blamed yourself for that? Have you put yourself down for that? Are you saying things like, oh, I should have cleaned the whole house today? I should have done this today? I should have done that today? I hope not. I hope you're acknowledging that you did the vacuuming. You can do the mopping tomorrow. I hope you acknowledge that, you did the washing. You can get to the rest of it tomorrow. You can break cleaning the house down into steps, achievable steps. You can do a little bit of cleaning each day. Maybe you didn't burn as many calories as you would have liked to. Maybe you're not down to that ideal weight that you have planned for yourself in that particular week. So what? Who cares? In 10 years from now, that's not going to mean anything, because in 10 years from now, you're going to be where you want to be anyway. There's steps we need to take to get there. Acknowledge the steps. What you tell yourself now and the mindset that you have is going to make more difference in 10 years from now than whether or not you cleaned the whole house today, or whether or not you lost enough calories today. That's when you're going to have that fixed mindset. You're going to fall off the wagon. You're going to lose motivation. You're going to fluctuate. You're going to put weight on, take it off. You really need to just step back and zoom out, see it for what it is, and know that you're still going to be where you're at in 10 years' time regardless. And you're going to have to acknowledge that it's really a key, important strategy to have that positive growth mindset. That's going to do more for you in 10 years than going to the gym or cleaning the house. Step 3 in that inner communication is being able to stop yourself when you're having those thoughts, acknowledge them, take a step back, have a breather, take a moment to just, push those thoughts aside and really just, ask yourself, what's the next step? Okay, that is part 3, okay, of that self-communication. The 3 steps so far, in that process of change and self-communication, those 3 steps have all been about being able to, step outside of yourself, get rid of that black and white thinking, set up that personal boundary around yourself so you're not letting the world, influence you and that black and white thinking influence you, and changing that sort of fixed mindset into a more of a growth mindset. But the reality is there's only so much that we can block out from the outside world. The reality is that that world around us is still going to have an impact on the inside. Those people around us, those people closest to us, have the most impact as to what's happening on the inside. But there's one simple change that we can make to the world around us that's going to change what's happening on the inside. The child will only accept your lead when it feels heard. To do this, imagine having a conversation with a 7-year-old version of yourself. It may be a bit painful at first, but it's important to listen to what your inner child wants you to know about how he or she has been feeling towards that stretch. Once you've unconditionally acknowledged those feelings, respond by asking yourself, what's the next step? What you want to do here is open a negotiation process by breaking down the process into bite-sized pieces to create stepping stones that make that stretch much smaller. This will help you make a start which will soon develop momentum and then become easier. To condition the task to start sliding across the confidence scale, remember to recognize and praise every bit of effort unconditionally, irrespective of the outcome. When you pay attention to all the little steps of progress, it becomes a lot easier to shrink down the overwhelm when you zoom out and see that bigger picture. Remember also that when you zoom out, you'll realize that the unconscious conditioning that your self-communication has in each moment will end up being far more important in the long run anyway. So far, the process has been on our internal dynamics. But in the next lesson, I'm going to show you one simple step you can take to change the environment on the outside, which will make the most powerful change on the inside.